Hello and welcome to this second lecture on Georgia and its territorial fragmentation. In today's lecture, what I want to do is I want to examine the case of Ossetia and the Ossetians, and I want to describe them as the loyalists of the Caucasus. So the title of the lecture is The Loyalists of the Caucasus, the Geopolitical Entanglements of Ossetia-Alania. I want to talk about a geographic, geopolitical imagination, a homeland which is not officially on maps. First of all, let's visit Google Earth and look at the area as a whole. The area that I want to talk about is North Ossetia, which North Ossetia-Alania is its official name, as you can see here. And right next to it is the ethnic republic of Ingushetia. Next to that is Chechnya. And then as we go south, we go into the disputed territory of South Ossetia, the capital of which is Skinval or Skinvali. So that's the area that I want to discuss. And the theme is really about the importance of the Ossetians as actors. Even though they're a very small Caucasian nation, they're very important as actors within the Caucasus, and we have to understand the case of South Ossetia within the context of the larger picture in the Caucasus, because the Ossetians straddle the North and South Caucasus as a nation, and that makes them somewhat unusual. As we will see in the case of the Abkhaz have ties to the Circassians in the north too, when we examine the Abkhaz case. Now, this is an ethnic plurality map of the Caucasus, and as you can see, North Ossetia and South Ossetia stand out. Now, this map is, as a choropleth map, is somewhat misleading in that when you look at the actual picture in South Ossetia on the ground, there are actually still Georgian villages in that area, although it's a lot more ethnically homogeneous than it was as a consequence of the August 2008 war. So the two regions, the two entities that we need to understand here are first North Ossetia, the North Ossetian Republic, which is in the Russian Federation. So it's one of the Caucasian ethnic republics. This is a poor area by and large. As you can see from the 2002 census, less than 750,000 people, and about 446,000 of whom are Ossetian or declared their ethnicity as Ossetian, 23% Russian, then a small minority of Ingush and Armenians. The Ossetians are distinctive in the Caucasus in that they are Orthodox people rather than a Muslim. Now, however, there are some Ossetians who are Muslim, who converted to Islam as a consequence of their subordination under Islamic polities which existed prior to the Russian Empire in the region. And the Ossetians are also divided into three different sub-ethnicities: the Ironi, the Digor, and the Kudar. The Kudar are mostly in the south, as we'll see. So you have, on the one hand, ethnic republic within the Russian Federation, and then on the other hand you have today, after the recognition by Russia and by a few other states, an ostensibly independent South Ossetia, a partially recognized state, a quasi-state. Here is the Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, shaking hands with Sergei Bagapsh, the president of Abkhazia, and Edward Kokoity, who is the president of South Ossetia. Now, the entity that is not on the map but is very significant for our purposes here is Transcaucasia Ossetia-Alania. This rather poor map is a photograph of a map showing both Ossetias together, unified, North and South Ossetia straddling the Caucasian range, the north-south, the east-west Caucasian range. Now, this particular map is available for those of you who want to see it up close in 1021 Prince Street at Virginia Tech's facilities in Alexandria. And what I've shown here are the maps of both polities, the North Ossetian polity and the South Ossetian state. And as you can see, both are the exact same. In fact, this flag is a flag which only dates from 1992. It originally was adopted in South Ossetia by the South Ossetian nationalist movement, was later adopted by North Ossetia as it transformed itself from a Soviet republic to a Russian Federation republic. The different colors are meant to represent different parts of the Ossetian nation. The white is meant to represent spirituality. Some also say it represents the snow of the Caucasian mountains. The red is representative of fighters, the warriors, which is a very, very important part of the Ossetian culture and of the culture of the Caucasian peoples writ large. And the yellow is meant to represent agriculture, the land, and the tilling of the land. This particular nationalism that we were examining, this imaginary community of Ossetia, Transcaucasian Ossetia-Alania, is it's imaginary, but it's a social construct, but nevertheless it's very, very real. And one of the things that's absolutely crucial to it is the Rocky Tunnel, which was constructed in the 1970s, and it links North and South Ossetia. It was originally constructed on with military justification. It was actually strongly opposed by the Georgian Soviet state at the time. Edward Shevardnadze was the head of it, but it got the go-ahead because of the influence of a number of top generals who were of Ossetian ethnicity in the Russian or the Soviet Red Army at the time. So it was constructed, and it proved really vital to resupplying South Ossetia when it was attacked by the Georgian forces in 2008 and also earlier, as we'll see. Now let's talk a little bit about the history of the Ossetians and their particular culture. The idea of Alania refers to two early historic kingdoms. Every particular nation in the Caucasus has a golden age, and for the Ossetians it is Alania. And as you can see here, Alania wasn't originally not in the area that it is today. It only emerged in the North Caucasus from the 18th century onwards. And the Ossetians, like the Georgians, converted to Byzantine Christianity. The Georgians, of course, much earlier. But the important point is the Ossetians converted to Christianity before their contact with the Tsarist Russian Empire. But that conversion nevertheless led to an affinity between the Russians and the Ossetians, which was missing in the case of other Muslim peoples in the Caucasus. Now, with the Mongol invasions, the Alans, or the Ossetians, the ancestors of the Ossetians, were forced further and further into the North Caucasus mountain ranges to escape from the hordes, the empires that were being created, the power structures of that time. And they actually went over the mountains. There's some dispute as to when this happened, but there's strong evidence that this happened in the 13th century. They went over the mountains from the north into the south, into the area that Georgians knew as Shida Kartli. Now, this was a very poorly populated area. It was an area where which was very, very difficult to live, and you sort of eked out a subsistence living in this area. But the divisions between the sub-ethnicities within the Ossetian state from this time. So the larger context is one in which the Ossetian nation, as a small nation which is constantly fearing its annihilation from larger structural forces, the Georgians in the south, the Ingush and Chechens in the to the east, and the Kabardins to the north, in a Muslim Islamic kingdom that converted some Ossetians. So they're having to adjust to a difficult geopolitical environment. This particular crest that you see there is the snow leopard, and the 7 peaks of the Caucasian Mountains is the particular icon of the Ossetians in the Caucasus. Now, the major geopolitical force reshaping the area from the 18th and especially in the 19th century was the Tsarist Empire. Vladikavkaz was established around about the time of the establishment of the United States, so in the 1770s. And the very name of the city, Vladikavkaz, victory in the Caucasus, indicated its particular intent. It was an imperial fort, which was a base for the exterminist and very, very brutal Caucasian wars that the Tsarist generals Yermolov and others waged across the North Caucasus and into the South Caucasus in the 19th century. Within that context, the Ossetians, after rebelling against the Russians, finally decided to become subjects and loyal subjects of the Russian state. So here you have an image from some statues, a whole display from the Memorial Park in Vladikavkaz, and this commemorates the moment when Ossetian elders pledged allegiance to Catherine the Great, and she granted them a local autonomy and a place within the Tsarist order and within the Tsarist army. And so they became very loyal foot soldiers of the Tsarist Empire, fighting against their neighbours and therefore bettering their position by allying themselves with the largest power in the region. And that's a pattern which exists to this day. Now, the period in the early 20th century from 1917 to 1922 saw massive revolutionary upheavals with the initial revolution in 1917, subsequent Bolshevik Revolution, and then the Russian Civil War, all of which was fought out in Vladikavkaz. There were many different factions in the city of Vladikavkaz, which was a major city in the Caucasus, in the North Caucasus. And the bulk of the Ossetians, as you might expect, backed the Tsarist regime and backed the White Army. But there were a number of Ossetians that were Bolsheviks who sought to overthrow the oppressive order as it existed. And then there were the Mensheviks, the Georgian Mensheviks, putting pressure on the Ossetians in South Ossetia, as we will see. Now, the South Ossetia is, as we've mentioned, a multi-ethnic space. It is one that the highlands of which, the very area closest to what now the Rocky Tunnel, where the Rocky Tunnel is, they were mostly Ossetians. The Ossetians were overwhelmingly farmers in this area, and the more lowland areas were occupied by the Georgians. Now, the Georgians were also lords and nobles at this time, and so they tended to control the land that some Ossetians, quite a few Ossetians, tilled in this area, which gave rise to certain frictions. And as you can see, there are also Greeks, Russians, Jews, and Armenians. As we mentioned in a previous lecture, the city of Skin Valley was established originally by Jewish settlers. This is a photograph that I took in March of 2010 of the old synagogue in Skin Valley. And as you can see, it was a beautiful building, 19th century building, which was destroyed during the Russian Revolution. It hasn't really been restored since. It was used during the Soviet period for storing grain and for storing weapons. And I just inserted a little detail there so you can see the Star of David. Now, Skinval still has a Jewish community and still has a synagogue, and so that presence, Jewish presence, exists to this day. Of course, it's much diminished as a consequence of the events of the 20th century and the 21st century. Quite a number left to go to Israel. When I was there, one of the people that was driving us around was Jewish and had come back from Israel, had left Israel to return back to his homeland, to his hometown of Skinval. This is a particular building which is now completely destroyed. It's north of Skinval, but it was the original ancestral home of the Machibeli family. Ivan Machibeli was a writer and an important figure in Georgian society. During the Soviet period, this was a museum, and in actual fact, you can go online and find this museum in virtual form, but it's now completely destroyed, and it's an area controlled by the South Ossetian state. The Georgians knew this lowland area as Samachibelo, the land of Machibeli. Now, the important thing that we need to note from the early part of the 20th century is this Georgian-Ossetian conflict, and it's important to sort of underscore the class basis for this. This was a peasant uprising by Ossetians in 1918 and also in 1919. And the Georgian state, the Menshevik-controlled independent Georgian state, sought to repress this, and repressed it quite brutally, particularly in the period April to June of 1920, when there was ethnic cleansing and about 5,000 people were killed. This is a searing event in the consciousness of Ossetians. It's seen as the first genocide against Ossetians by the Georgian state, and it's a very, very important moment. Now, the Ossetians declared a Soviet republic in the area and sided with the Bolsheviks against the Mensheviks. And in 1921, the Red Army invaded Georgia and overthrew the Menshevik state and established Georgia as a Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast, which is different from an autonomous republic, it's at a lower level, that was established in this period. And it's important to understand why it was established. The sort of standard Georgian perception and line soundbite on this is that it was a Bolshevik plot. It was something created by the Bolsheviks, and it was a sort of wedge to undermine the Georgian state, and that's a sort of a favoured narrative of Georgians. And what I wanted to draw your attention to was one of the articles that I had assigned. This is the article by Arseny Saparov, From Conflict to Autonomy, the Making of a South Ossetian Autonomous Region. And the important point that he makes, and you should read this closely, is that in actual fact it was not created as a result of a sort of divide and rule policy by the Bolsheviks, but it was an attempt at conflict resolution to try to address two incompatible claims on that area, the Georgian claim and then the Ossetian desire to unite that area with North Ossetia to create a unified Ossetia-Alania. So if I can find the article, the kind of key conclusion that is from this article, I have it here in front of me. A nice summary is at the top of page 109. Let's see if I find that for you. So you can read it along here. So this brief survey of relations between Georgia and Ossetians during the Civil War allows for the following conclusion. The conflict started as an unorganized social movement for land redistribution primarily among Ossetian peasants. However, soon after the ethnic dimension of that social conflict acquired a more important role since the landowners were traditionally Georgian nobles. The conflict thus turned into an antagonism between Georgians and Ossetians. In this new situation, the Ossetians found support from the Bolsheviks in North Caucasus. The Ossetians in Georgia acquired a Bolshevik orientation as their political situation. Peasants struggling against aristocratic landowners could be easily integrated into the Bolshevik ideological discourse. We thus have a situation where initial social conflict evolved into ethnic antagonism, which in turn acquired a political dimension. It's a very, very nice summary. And then he makes the argument, which is on page 120, is that this was an attempt, a halfway solution between these two different claims. So that's important to kind of understand the origins of the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast. The area was Sovietized and successfully so, and good relations were established between the Georgians, Ossetians and other nationalities in this region. But nevertheless there were contradictions, because in Sovietizing you nevertheless reinforced ethnic national identity. There was a creation of instruments for nationalist mobilizations, the theatres, the language, and that became a subject of dispute when there was a Georgification of the Ossetian language in this area in the from the 1930s as a result of the policies in Beria. We'll look at that in greater detail when we examine Abkhazia. Before it was then returned to the Cyrillic alphabet in 1954 with the death of Stalin and later the fall of Beria. You have the contradictions here. You have a multi-ethnic condition and you have lots of intermarriages, but it was dependent upon an authoritarian system. It was dependent upon strong central rule. And then the contradiction also, the democracy in this area meant the return of ethnocratic tyranny. Now let's say a few more things about the Ossetians more generally. They were and proved to be the most Sovietized Caucasian peoples, just like they were foot soldiers of and also generals in the Tsarist Empire. They proved to be the same in the Red Army and rose to very significant positions of power within the Red Army. And this is some statues from that memorial park, including a statue of a general who fell in the Chechen War. Now, the area's political geography shifted quite significantly. This is somewhat complicated, but let me just very briefly tell the story. From 1921, the attempt to try to create a mountainous Soviet republic, unifying all the different nations in this area, gave way to the establishment of a much more explicit ethno-territorial form in which you have a certain ethnicity which and it's having designated a certain homeland. Of course, that was not likely to satisfy because these ethnicities were blended, they shared space. But nevertheless, the initial attempt was one which led to the city of Vladikavkaz becoming shared between the Ingush and North Ossetians. There was a large Ingush population in Vladikavkaz, much more so than today. You also had the establishment of Chechnya as an autonomous area as well, an autonomous oblast. The key moment of change is in the early 1930s when Stalin takes power and he begins to tilt towards the Ossetians and awards Vladikavkaz to the Ossetians only and begins to align the Ingush with the Chechens. But this tilt towards the Ossetians became very, very pronounced with World War II. Now, World War II affected this area. The Soviet army made a push into this area, and here is a very grainy photograph of the Germans putting a swastika above Erebus. And if I could just read from this particular book, which is a famous book on the punished peoples, the deportation and tragic fate of Soviet minorities at the end of the Second World War by Alexander Nekrich. So he says that in the case of the North Caucasus, so this is 1942, on August 21, the Germans placed their flag with its emblem, the swastika, on the peak of Mount Elbrus. Now, Elbrus is the largest mountain in the Caucasus. And there it waved until February 17, 1943, when it was torn down by Soviet soldiers and replaced with the state flag of the USSR. So in 1942, the Germans were pushing through this area. They did actually capture Vladikavkaz, and here I have a map of the region, and it's highlighting the town of Maklobek, which is actually in Ingushetia. And that area is important because that's the territorial extent of the German army, of the Wehrmacht, during World War II. That's as far as they got. They were pushing towards Baku, they were pushing in the south, and they were pushing towards Makashkala, the capital of Dagestan, and Grozny in particular, to get the oil wells. But they never got to Grozny. They were stopped here, and then they began to be pushed back. They did capture a number of the mountain passes, and they did capture Vladikavkaz for a while. Now that proved very, very significant. Maklobek was the area that saw the stopping of the German army by the Red Army. As you can read there, in October 2007, Maklobek was conferred the status of City of Military Glory by President Vladimir Putin for heroically stopping the German forces at its borders. Alright, so what did that mean? Well, the World War II in the area had tremendous impact. What happened was that Stalin, after the Red Army had pushed back the German army, began to designate a series of ethnicities as having collaborated with the Germans. The most significant of these were the Chechens, the largest group, but you also had the Ingush targeted as well, the Kabardins, and the German ethnic Germans that lived in that area. And you had the deportation of these very, very suddenly in cattle cars to Central Asia. It was a very brutal act, and it was one where thousands died, but the peoples were moved to Central Asia, to Kazakhstan, where they lived for quite a number of years until the 1950s, until Stalin's death in 1954, and then gradually be able to come back. This is significant because to replace those peoples who had been forcibly deported, the Soviet authorities began to move people from other regions, including quote-unquote loyal Ossetians from South Ossetia. They were moved to Prigrodny, which is an area to the east of Vladikavkaz. And so the ties that already existed between Ossetians in South Ossetia and North Ossetia got even closer. A number of South Ossetians lived then in North Ossetia, and those ties exist to this day. The North Ossetian ASSR that was established during the Soviet period, so it was an ethnic republic within the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, and was a bastion of loyalty. Stalin was a revered figure there, but in the period of de-Stalinization, those Stalin statues disappeared. They then returned in the period when the Soviet Union collapsed, and that is where we will leave it. That collapse, the collapse in the federal center, then created all sorts of dynamics. The entanglements that the Ossetians were left with the collapse of the USSR, were first within Georgia, and we will examine that complicated situation. Secondly, with Ingushetia, where in the return of territory in the 1950s to the peoples coming back, not all of Ingushetia was returned, particularly the area eastern Prigrodny was not returned to Ingushetia, and became a source of tremendous conflict between the Ossetians and the Ingush. The conflict in Georgia played into that too, and very briefly the story is when the Ossetians from Georgia writ large, not simply South Ossetia, 165,000 of them, were ethnically cleansed from or driven out of Georgia. They came into North Ossetia in large numbers, thousands upon thousands of people, almost 40% of the population swamping the area. And that had a ripple effect in Prigrodny, just at the time that the Ingush were making a claim for that. And then that led to a violent conflict between the Ingush and the Ossetians in October of 1992. The third entanglement is the entanglement of the Ossetians serving in the Russian army with Chechnya, and of course the tragic terrorism that occurred on the territory of North Ossetia in September of 2004 at School Number 1 in Beslan, which I have written on. So that is a set of points about the Ossetians. Let me just end with a few videos so you can give you some feel of the place. This is the particular situation from Vladikavkaz. This is looking at Vladikavkaz, looking out on the mountains. So you can see the mountains there in the distance. And then let's look closely at the mountains themselves. This is up towards the as you're driving towards the Rocky Tunnel. As you can see, it's really quite desolate. This is filmed in March of 2010. So and the sound effect will. And finally, this is what the Rocky Tunnel looks like inside itself. It's actually in really good shape compared to quite a lot of the tunnels that you encounter in the former Soviet Union and also in Yugoslavia. And that is the light at the end of the tunnel, and that's where we will leave it. So I hope this has been useful for you as an overview of the situation of the Ossetians in the north, in the Caucasus region generally.